Ray Tannehill and Patty Burns. Sports with Bill Curry and weather with Bob Cudson.
Good evening. Ray Tannehill is off tonight. In the news, President Carter is preparing to announce his choice of Western Pennsylvania's next federal judge. Eyewitness News reporter Charles Bosworth has found that one top local candidate, Rosalind Littman, has a history of personal and business relationships that call into question her ethics and sensitivities and may make her unfit for the job.
There's no question that Mrs. Littman has a first-rate legal mind and has a great deal of influence in the Pittsburgh area. But despite her uncontested legal abilities and despite her influence, a significant number of people have told me they have big worries about her holding such an important lifetime position. My investigation has placed her within a very intricate web of business and personal relationships that could mean she's unfit for the job. Questions about Mrs. Littman usually begin with Tavern Lending Corporation. She and her husband David jointly own about 30% of it. They also completely own the firm that actually manages Tavern Lending. Tavern Lending lends money to people who want to open up bars. Interest and fees on the loans can amount to more than 40% a year. In one case, Tavern Lending wanted a 20% return in 1 month. Who would borrow money at those rates? Well, for the most part, they're just good, honest people who simply need the money. But my investigation has turned up evidence that bars financed through Tavern Lending are controlled or allegedly controlled by Kyler Reynolds, a convicted heroin dealer; Leonard Schumpert, another convicted heroin dealer who's now under indictment for still more sales; reputed mafia member Joey DeMarco; Robert Ficklin, who's pled guilty in the Manpower scandal; and Jocko Hetherington, who's been convicted of voluntary manslaughter and who's been characterized by police as a punk. Two other rackets figures connected to Tavern Lending loans are convicted gambling racketeer Sykes Tallarico and hijacker Lolly Volpe. David Littman explained that either Tavern Lending did not know these people had an interest in the bars, or they were not convicted felons at the time the loans were made. When Hetherington's bar here on the Youghiogheny in McKeesport burned down a few years ago under very suspicious circumstances, Mrs. Littman's husband David represented Hetherington in his insurance claim. A large part of the settlement went to pay off Hetherington's note to Tavern Lending. Lawyers have told me that it was wrong for David Littman to represent Hetherington because Rosalind and David Littman had a significant piece of that settlement action. Mrs. Littman said it would be improper to be interviewed on film, but said her law firm is scrupulously ethical, and she's sure there were no ethical violations. But I found still another instance of apparent conflict of interest in the Littman law firm. Rosalind, David, Eugene Littman, and his wife, and another couple, developed this apartment complex in Wilkinsburg as part of an Allegheny County Redevelopment Authority project. The official in charge of the project was David R. Brown. Just 3 months after the deal was finalized, Brown left the authority and went to work as a lawyer in the Littman law firm. He then represented the Littmans in their dealings with his former employer until the project was completed. Although this appears to be a conflict of interest, Rosalind Littman told me it was not, because Brown didn't grant any favors while he worked for the authority. The job offer for the law firm wasn't given until after the deal was finalized, and even then, Brown worked only on technical matters. Nevertheless, the lawyer's code of professional responsibility clearly prohibits not only actual conflicts, but the appearance of conflict as well. These instances appear to be basically a matter of ethics, but there are more serious problems developing within the Littman law firm. One member of the firm is a top suspect in a massive insurance fraud case. Lawyers and doctors allegedly conspired to cheat insurance companies on medical claims. While neither Rosalind nor David are targets at this time, one other person who is a target is Dr. M.A. Rosenblum. Dr. Rosenblum is related to the Littmans through marriage, keeps his office in a building put up by Eugene Littman, Rosalind Littman's brother-in-law, lives in the condominium developed by Eugene Littman, and has been a business associate of Eugene Littman and other members of the family. In fact, Rosalind Littman's business relationships with Eugene and his associates are another area of concern. Eugene, who operates out of this North for Sales building, is a successful businessman with investments in apartment complexes, real estate, and insurance, among other things. Eugene and Rosalind Littman own this building on the south side. One of the tenants is a small company called Take Me, Paint Me. The incorporator is Tech Skill, a notorious madam who dresses like a man and is considered an heir to the sex empire of prostitution kingpin George Lee. Lee was killed last year in a gangland-style murder. Police believe Tech Skill uses the store to launder money she illegally earns from the prostitution business. The sign on the building shows Eugene Littman's real estate company is the rental agent. A unique coincidence, but maybe not. Eugene used to employ a man named John Sabatini. Sabatini used to run a massage parlor in Wilkinsburg until it was blown to bits 5 years ago. Police sources tell me that Sabatini's prostitutes were supplied by Tech Skill. Eugene told me he didn't even know Tech Skill was a woman until she became prominently mentioned in the news. Rosalind Littman told me she had nothing to do with renting the space to Tech Skill. Eugene says he doesn't even remember Sabatini working for him. Among Eugene's other business associates or tenants we've been able to identify are at least 4 organized crime figures, 3 well-known arsonists, and 3 key figures in the manpower scandal. Edward Boyer is another business associate of both Eugene and Rosalind Littman. He's been cited by the Securities and Exchange Commission in the Meadowlands Hilton scheme, in which more than 100 small investors were built out of more than $1.5 million. Boyer operated the scheme through a company that was at one time a subsidiary of Rosalind and David's Tavern Lending. Boyer has been involved with Mrs. Littman and other members of the Littman family in real estate and banking as well. And right now, Boyer is under investigation by the Allegheny County District Attorney because up to $3 million disappeared while he was North for Sale's tax collector.
Charlie, is there any indication that Mrs. Littman is personally involved with these kinds of people?
Yes, one of Mrs. Littman's longtime friends is a man named Jim Ashton. Ashton is another questionable person. Although Mrs. Littman said she would not describe him as a close friend, there's no question that he was a good deal more than just a passing acquaintance. He's also been a business associate of David Littman. Ashton is a convicted felon and disbarred lawyer. He was also a close friend of Tony Repepe, a reputed mafia captain. And that brings up another point. 14 years ago, David Littman organized a business trip to the Bahamas for prospective developers. According to someone on the trip, when the group arrived at the greater Pittsburgh airport, Mrs. Littman hugged and kissed one of her fellow travelers, the same Tony Repepe. David Littman, we're told, later identified Repepe as a mafia member invited along to check out the possibilities of opening a gambling casino in Freeport. At first, Mrs. Littman denied taking the trip with Repepe, let alone hugging and kissing him. She later told me that Repepe did go along after being invited by Jim Ashton. She said she hardly knew Repepe and never did any business with him, and says now that she can't recall hugging and kissing him.
This is a complex web of people and relationships that you've uncovered, Charlie, but what does it all mean?
Well, federal judges handle matters of great importance. It's necessary that they not only be technically skilled, but also that they be above any suspicion of unethical conduct. Even more, they have to avoid even the appearance of any suspicion. Any questions about the qualifications, ethics, or business sensitivities should be raised before they're appointed, not after. And that's because federal judges are appointed for life. I haven't questioned Mrs. Littman's technical abilities, but many lawyers are worried about the ethical practices of the Littman law firm. Law enforcement personnel have told me they wouldn't have confidence in Mrs. Littman as a judge because of the Littman family's relationships with crime figures. Mrs. Littman told me she served the community well for 26 years and is blameless of all allegations. She said her record as a lawyer and a public servant, not the Littman family, should be the basis of her appointment to the federal bench. She did admit that if she becomes a judge, she'll have to be especially careful about her personal associations. While any of these relationships we've been discussing may not raise serious doubts, the pattern, the web, certainly does.
Good evening. Ray is off this week and Patty has been pinch hitting for him. Tonight, Eyewitness News investigative reporter Charles Bosworth has more on a Pittsburgh attorney who is a top candidate to be a federal judge here. At the 6 o'clock news, Bosworth reported that questions have arisen regarding Rosalind Littman. The questions involved ethical practices of her law firm, business associations of both her and the Littman law firm. He now has a further report.
Bill, by all accounts, Mrs. Littman has a first-rate legal mind. She's smart enough and experienced enough to be an excellent federal judge. But a significant number of people, especially lawyers and law enforcement officials, have told me they're worried. Lawyers have told me they're worried about possibly unethical practices in Mrs. Littman's law firm. Law enforcement personnel are concerned about her and especially the Littman family's history of personal and business relationships with organized criminals. For example, Mrs. Littman and her husband own a major part of Tavern Lending Corporation. Tavern Lending provides money for people who want to open up bars. My investigation has uncovered loans to bars that are controlled or allegedly controlled by 2 convicted heroin dealers, 3 reputed organized crime figures, a convicted killer, and a key figure in the manpower scandal. Mrs. Littman's husband David told me that either Tavern Lending did not know the bars were controlled by organized crime figures, or the owners hadn't been convicted at the time the loans were made. In addition, Tavern Lending may charge exorbitant rates for its money. We've found rates totaling more than 40% a year. In one case, Tavern Lending wanted a 20% return in 1 month. We found a number of instances of apparent ethical violations by Mrs. Littman's law firm. For example, an Allegheny County Redevelopment Authority lawyer joined the firm shortly after overseeing plans on this apartment complex that Mr. and Mrs. Littman and others developed in Wilkinsburg. Mrs. Littman said there was nothing wrong with that because the lawyer didn't join the firm until after the apartment deal was finalized. Well, maybe, but the lawyer's code of professional responsibility forbids not only actual conflict, but the appearance of conflict as well. In another case, David Littman handled the insurance claim of a Tavern Lending customer. Much of the cash settlement went to pay off his Tavern Lending note. Lawyers are not supposed to have a money interest in their clients' cases. As one lawyer told me, I like to keep my hands out of my clients' pockets. Then there's this. Someone in the Littman law firm is a top suspect in a massive insurance fraud case. And 2 of the doctors involved in the case are connected to the Littman family through marriage, business, or both. I further learned that Mr. or Mrs. Littman may also be suspects, although they're not targets of the investigation at this time. On the business side, Mrs. Littman is part owner of this building on the south side. One of the tenants is Tex Skill, the notorious madam who's considered an heir to George Lee's prostitution empire. Lee, as you may remember, was murdered last year, setting off the so-called massage parlor war. The other owner of the building is Mrs. Littman's brother-in-law, Eugene Littman. Eugene said Tex Gill simply answered an ad in the paper. But one of Eugene's former employees was alleged prostitution boss John Sabatini. Tex Gill, according to police sources, used to supply Sabatini's whores. Eugene Littman himself is a part of the concern about Mrs. Littman's possible judgeship. He's not just her brother-in-law, but a business associate as well. He used to own the Quality Courts Motel in North Versailles, which was known to law enforcement officials as a hangout for gangsters and prostitutes. Among Eugene's tenants and business associates are at least 2 top-level organized crime figures, 2 convicted gambling racketeers, 3 key figures in the manpower scandal, and a businessman cited for securities fraud. Rosalind and David Littman have also been close to Jim Ashton, a disbarred lawyer and convicted felon who was once a business associate with David Littman and was also close to reputed mafia captain Tony Repepi. Repepi himself went on a business trip to the Bahamas with the Littmans 14 years ago. At the time of the trip, we're told, Mrs. Littman greeted Repepi with an affectionate hug and kiss. Mrs. Littman at first said she didn't remember taking the trip with Repepi. She later said Repepi did come along, but only on the invitation of Jim Ashton. She denied, however, having any business or personal relationship with him. Mrs. Littman says she's blameless and spotless. She says she served the community well for 26 years and would make an excellent judge. Many people agree, but others have serious doubts. For example, one law enforcement officer told me that considering her background and the background of the Littman family, he would be afraid to take a wiretap request to her because he couldn't be confident the information would be secure. As a federal judge, Mrs. Littman would handle matters of great importance and sensitivity. So it's not only important that she know the law, her ethics and her background must be above suspicion as well. And since federal judges are appointed for life, it's vital that any questions about her fitness for office be discussed before an appointment is made. We weren't able to reach Mrs. Littman tonight for further comment. However, former Mayor Pete Flaherty, a friend and political ally, told us he would be shocked to find anything in her background that would hurt her chances to be a federal judge. Flaherty appointed her head of the city parking authority and said she did an excellent and honest job. Patty?
I am Rosalind Littman. Earlier this evening, I described to you an attack by KDKA on my personal ethics and integrity and my qualifications to serve if nominated as a federal court judge. I said, among other things, that a so-called investigative report by KDKA and its reporter violated every rule of decency and honest reporting. This station invoked innuendo where it lacked facts. It employed hearsay where no evidence existed. It used inference as a substitute for concrete information. It blatantly implied guilt by association, associations drummed up by KDKA. In the end, it was a disgraceful exhibition which was demeaning to the concept of a free press, grossly insulting to its viewers, and viciously unfair to me. What follows are among the worst of a series of false statements and impressions issued by this station and the facts, as the facts exist in truth. Because I have been given only a limited amount of time by KDKA, I will not be able to deal with all the false statements made by its reporter, but I will bring to your attention what are among the worst of what he had to say. KDKA identified my husband David and me as major stockholders in the Tavern Lending Corporation and claimed that we were responsible for lending monies to a series of allegedly disreputable persons. The facts. My husband and I own 30% of the stock. There are 36 other shareholders. I am neither an officer nor a director. I have no involvement in the operation of the company. I have no more involvement than you would have if you owned shares in the United States Steel Corporation, the H.J. Heinz Company, or the Mellon Bank. KDKA falsely asserted that Tavern Lending loans money and that the interest and fees on those loans amount to more than 40% a year. The facts. There is a law in the state of Pennsylvania which makes it a crime to loan money at that rate. Tavern Lending has examined more than 700 outstanding and paid loans. No borrower has ever repaid a loan at the rate of anywhere close to 40%. For the record, the company has a proud history of charging lower interest rates than any company of its kind in Pennsylvania. KDKA left the false impression that Tavern Lending had obtained a 20% return in 1 month on an outstanding loan. The facts. It never happened. KDKA falsely asserted that liquor establishments financed by Tavern Lending are controlled by 2 convicted heroin dealers and an alleged organized crime figure. The facts. The company never provided loans to the 3 persons named by KDKA or to any corporation in which any of the 3 persons had an interest. KDKA falsely asserted that Tavern Lending provided funds to a 4th person who pleaded guilty in the local manpower scandal. The facts. The person named by KDKA was involved in the illegal activity 3 years after he applied for and received the loan. KDKA falsely asserted that a 5th person, named and described by KDKA as a convicted killer, obtained a loan from the company. The facts. The loan was made in 1966. The man named by KDKA was charged with the crime 9 years later in 1975. Worse yet, that man was acquitted of the criminal charges after a trial by jury. But he has not yet been acquitted by KDKA. KDKA falsely asserted that 2 other racket figures were somehow connected to Tavern Lending. The facts. The first alleged racket figure was not the actual borrower, his wife was. Moreover, the liquor board examined the circumstances of that man's involvement with the law. The board determined that he had been arrested for a misdemeanor 12 years earlier and that the charges against him had been dismissed. The board approved the man and his wife for the license. As to the second man named by KDKA, he was said by KDKA to be a hijacker. The plain and simple fact is that he had no criminal record when he applied for and received the loan. Moreover, the liquor board investigated and approved his fitness to operate a liquor establishment at the time he applied for the loan, and that was long before he violated the law. This was how KDKA tried to make you believe that my partial ownership of stock in the company which provided them with loans somehow made me responsible for actions that took place long after the original loans were granted. And of the persons named by KDKA, 3 were never given loans, and, to repeat, none of the others had any conflicts with the law at the time the original loans were made. How can any fair-minded person conclude from what you have just heard that I have a history of personal and business relationships that call into question my ethics and sensitivities? The irony of all of this is that KDKA was informed that its reporter had embarked on a slipshod path which would inevitably lead him to make unjust, unfair, and inaccurate assumptions. One cannot escape the conclusion that KDKA and its reporter made a conscious choice to present you with sensationalism over accuracy. What a mass of distortion, a distortion that just kept going and growing. KDKA suggested to you that my law firm had engaged in unethical practices because we hired David Brown, an employee of the Allegheny County Development Authority, 3 months after my husband and I and others had dealings with the authority. The facts are that our law firm does not engage in unethical practices, and the hiring of David Brown was not such a practice. A distinguished professor of ethics studied the incident. He concluded and so informed KDKA that there was no violation of professional or ethical responsibility or even the very appearance of impropriety. And in one last area, because KDKA will not permit me any more time, KDKA asserted that my business relationships with my husband's brother and his so-called associates were a supposed area of concern. The facts are that I have no dealings with any associates or tenants of my husband's brother, who is an ethical and moral man. This is just another in a series of irrelevancies created by KDKA to support its tattered web of innuendo and false facts. In conclusion, KDKA's reporter has made an unforgivable attempt to smear my reputation on the basis of a bungled attempt to emulate the respected discipline of investigative reporting. In doing so, KDKA permitted its reporter and its editor to pile wrong upon wrong, to question my integrity, and to reflect on my fitness to be named the first woman judge for the Federal District of Western Pennsylvania. But even worse, much worse, KDKA, which has a total responsibility to inform the public, permitted its reporter and its editor to misinform the public. And nothing they do or say after I leave you tonight will change those facts. Thank you for spending this time with me.